The town of Everdale had a way of making time slow down. It was the kind of place where autumn leaves lingered on cobblestone streets, where the scent of fresh bread from the local bakery drifted through open windows, and where the small, independent bookstore, Langley's Books, had stood for nearly half a century. Inside the shop, towering wooden bookshelves curved along the walls, cradling stories from every corner of the world. The air carried the scent of old parchment and ink, mixed with a faint trace of vanilla from a candle that had long since burned out. At the center of it all was Alfred Langley, a man who had spent more years surrounded by books than by people. Alfred had inherited the bookstore from his late friend and mentor, Edward Clark. Though he was not an overly sentimental man, he kept things just as Edward had left them. The old mahogany counter, the grandfather clock that always seemed to run a minute slow, even the faded armchair by the front window where Edward had once sat, reading on quiet afternoons, all remained untouched, as if waiting for someone who would never return. But something had changed in recent weeks. Every evening, just as Alfred was preparing to close up shop, a small, scruffy terrier appeared outside the door. The dog, thin with wiry fur the color of burnt toast, would sit patiently, staring at the entrance as if expecting someone to step out. It never barked, never whined. It simply waited. At first, Alfred had ignored it. The town had its fair share of strays, and he assumed the dog would move on. But night after night, it returned, curling up by the doorway, undeterred by the cold. The townspeople had started to notice too. A few regular customers would glance at the dog on their way in or out, some offering scraps of food or a pat on the head. But no one knew where it had come from or why it had chosen Langley's Books as its vigil. One evening, as the autumn chill deepened into the first whispers of winter, Alfred found himself pausing before locking up. He looked down at the little terrier, who raised its head slightly, ears twitching. There was something in the dog's dark eyes, something patient and knowing, as if it carried a story that only it understood. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Alfred sighed and took a step back, leaving the door open just a crack longer than usual. "Well," he muttered, more to himself than the dog. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." With that, he locked the door and walked away. Behind him, the dog remained, a silent shadow against the golden glow of the shop's windows. The next morning, Alfred Langley found himself thinking about the dog. It was an odd distraction for a man who had built his life around solitude. He had never been one for pets, never saw the point really. Books were easier. They didn't bark, didn't require feeding, and most importantly, they never left. Yet, as he walked through town on his way to the shop, he couldn't help but glance toward the front entrance, half expecting to see the little terrier still curled up by the door. He wasn't disappointed. There it was, sitting in the exact same spot, watching the door with unwavering focus. A dusting of frost clung to the tips of its fur, and as Alfred approached, the dog lifted its head slightly, ears perking up. He hesitated. "Still here?" he muttered, as if expecting a response. The terrier blinked, but didn't move. Alfred sighed, fumbling for the keys in his coat pocket. He should have ignored it, should have stepped over the tiny creature and gone about his day. But something made him pause, a nagging curiosity, an unspoken question, hanging between them. Before he could think better of it, he reached into his bag, pulled out half of the sandwich he'd packed for lunch, and crouched down. He hesitated for a moment, then placed it on the ground, just a few inches away from the dog. "There," he muttered. "Not much, but it's something." The dog looked at the food, then at Alfred. Its eyes were impossibly deep, holding something almost human in their quiet patience. It didn't lunge for the meal like a starving stray would. Instead, it sniffed cautiously, then took a small, measured bite, chewing slowly. Alfred watched, mildly surprised. "You're not in a hurry, are you?" The dog's tail thumped lightly against the stone pavement. For the rest of the morning, Alfred tried to put the encounter out of his mind. He busied himself with restocking shelves, sorting through deliveries, and tending to the handful of customers who trickled in and out. Yet, every time he glanced toward the door, he caught sight of the dog, still sitting there, still waiting. By midday, it was clear the little terrier had no intention of leaving. Mrs. Holloway, one of the shop's oldest patrons, noticed Alfred's distracted glances and followed his gaze. She let out a soft chuckle. "He's quite the determined little thing, isn't he?" she mused, adjusting her woolen shawl. Alfred grunted. "Seems that way. You know, my Harold used to say that animals come to us for a reason, like they know something we don't." Alfred rolled his eyes, but didn't argue. He didn't believe in sentimental nonsense, but he couldn't deny that the dog's behavior was unusual. As the day wore on, Alfred found himself growing increasingly restless. He had dealt with stray cats wandering near the shop before, even the occasional bird that had found its way inside, but this was different. This dog wasn't just passing through, it was waiting for something, or someone. The thought made his stomach tighten in a way he didn't quite understand. As evening approached, Alfred made a decision. Before closing up for the night, he stepped outside and knelt beside the little terrier, who looked up at him with quiet patience. "All right," Alfred said, sighing. "I don't know who you belong to, but if you're going to keep sitting here, you might as well be warm." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded wool scarf. It wasn't much, but it was better than the freezing pavement. He laid it down beside the dog, who sniffed it curiously before stepping onto it, curling up with a soft huff of contentment. Alfred shook his head. "You really don't plan on leaving, do you?" The terrier's tail wagged once, slow and deliberate. For the first time in years, Alfred felt a faint tug of something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to affection. Without another word, he turned and stepped inside, leaving the door open just a moment longer than usual before locking it behind him. Days turned into weeks, and the little terrier, now affectionately called Booker, became a fixture outside Langley's Books. Each morning, Alfred found him waiting by the door, his dark eyes following the old man's every movement. Though Alfred tried to maintain a gruff indifference, he couldn't help but soften each time he saw the small dog wag its tail at his approach. By the end of the first week, Alfred began leaving out proper meals, small bowls of stew or bits of ham wrapped in napkins. Booker accepted them with quiet gratitude, never begging, never making a fuss. The townspeople took notice, and soon the story of the loyal little dog outside the bookshop began to spread. Children stopped by to offer scraps, and Mrs. Holloway would often leave a knitted square of fabric or a small blanket whenever the nights grew colder. Alfred told himself it was simply practical. Better to feed the dog than to have it scrounging around the shop. Yet, as days passed, he found himself talking to Booker in low, quiet tones while he sorted books or brewed his evening tea. The dog would tilt his head, listening as if he understood every word. It was a strange companionship, silent, patient, and oddly comforting. One evening, Alfred set down a bowl of warm broth outside the door, watching from the window as Booker ate. The little terrier's tail thumped against the ground, a steady rhythm that matched the ticking of the grandfather clock inside. For the first time in years, the shop didn't feel quite so empty. It was Mrs. Holloway who first suggested letting Booker inside. "He's earned his place, don't you think?" she said one blustery afternoon, adjusting her shawl as she lingered by the counter. Alfred scowled. "He's fine where he is." But even as he spoke, he knew he was lying. To her and to himself. That night, as rain pattered against the windows and the wind howled through the narrow streets, Alfred found himself standing by the door with his hand on the latch. He glanced outside, where Booker lay curled up on his blanket, ears flicking at every gust of wind. "Stubborn little thing," Alfred muttered. He opened the door just a crack. "You coming in, or not?" For a long moment, Booker didn't move. Then, with careful steps, he crossed the threshold, shaking off the rain, before padding silently to the corner where the old armchair stood. He curled up beside it, as if he had always belonged there. Alfred locked the door behind him, feeling the warmth of the small body filling the quiet space. "Just for the night," he muttered. But they both knew better. Weeks passed, and Booker became a permanent resident of Langley's Books. He followed Alfred around the shop, his small paws clicking against the wooden floors. Customers began asking after him by name, bringing treats and scratching behind his ears as they browsed the shelves. The little terrier had a knack for sensing when someone needed comfort, settling at their feet or offering a gentle nudge of his nose. Yet, despite the growing affection, something about Booker remained a mystery. He was too clean, too well-mannered to have been a stray all his life. And there was a sadness in his eyes, an unspoken grief that lingered just beneath the surface. One stormy evening, as rain lashed against the windows, Alfred sat by the counter with a book in hand. Booker lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the shelves. Alfred glanced down at the little dog, his brow furrowed. "Who were you waiting for, eh?" he murmured. Booker's ears twitched, but he didn't lift his head. Curiosity gnawed at Alfred. That night, after locking up, he went to the back room and began sifting through old shop records, ledgers, receipts, and notes left behind by Edward Clark. Hours passed, the rain drumming steadily outside. Finally, buried beneath a stack of faded papers, Alfred found what he was looking for, a photograph. It showed Edward Clark standing in front of the shop, smiling beneath his wire-rimmed glasses. Beside him sat a small terrier, its fur wiry and dark, eyes bright with loyalty. Alfred's breath caught in his throat. Booker. He traced a finger along the edges of the photo, memories stirring in the quiet. Edward had always loved dogs, spoken of them like family. But when Edward had passed suddenly, years ago, the dog had disappeared. No one had known what became of him. Until now. Alfred glanced toward the front of the shop, where Booker still lay curled beside the armchair. The little terrier's eyes were half closed, his breathing steady. He had been waiting all this time, waiting for someone who would never return. Alfred swallowed hard, the weight of the revelation settling deep in his chest. "You old fool," he whispered to himself. "You've been waiting too." He crossed the room and knelt beside the dog, running a gentle hand along the wiry fur. "Well, you're home now," he murmured. Booker's tail thumped softly, his eyes flicking open just long enough to meet Alfred's gaze before drifting back to sleep. Outside, the rain continued to fall. But inside the little bookshop, the waiting was finally over. As days turned into months, Alfred often found himself watching Booker with a mix of affection and quiet reverence. The bond between them had grown, wordless but profound. Booker had become more than a companion. He was a living thread, tying the past to the present. Alfred couldn't shake the feeling that Edward's spirit lingered in the shop, watching over them both. Every time Booker settled beside the grandfather clock or sniffed at the worn armchair, Alfred felt the ghost of his old friend's presence, a bittersweet comfort that made the loneliness a little easier to bear. One crisp morning, Alfred decided to visit the town archives. He sifted through yellowed newspaper clippings and handwritten records until he found a small obituary for Edward Clark. It mentioned the faithful dog that had disappeared after his master's passing, an unresolved mystery that had quietly faded into local legend. With the truth finally laid bare, Alfred returned to the bookshop and knelt beside Booker, scratching behind his ears. "Guess you were always meant to find your way back," he murmured. Booker licked Alfred's hand, his tail wagging softly. From that day forward, Booker's place in the shop was official. A small brass tag, engraved with his name, hung by the front counter, and customers would often leave treats in a little ceramic dish marked Booker's Corner. The bond between man and dog deepened. Two old souls who had found each other in the quiet refuge of books and time. Outside, the seasons changed. But within the walls of Langley's books, some stories never truly ended. Years passed, and Langley's books became a cornerstone of the town's charm. Booker, with his grizzled muzzle and unwavering loyalty, remained at Alfred's side, an unspoken guardian of the stories within those walls. Children who had once fed him scraps now brought their own children to meet the legendary bookstore dog. The bond between Alfred and Booker became a quiet testament to second chances. Alfred's once solitary life had been gently unraveled by the presence of the little terrier, filling the empty corners of the shop with warmth. When Alfred's time finally came, the townspeople ensured that Booker would never be alone. A plaque was placed beside the armchair where Booker always curled up, reading, "In memory of Alfred Langley and his faithful guardian, Booker." The bookshop continued to flourish, with Booker's gentle spirit living on in every corner. His story became a part of Everdale's history, a reminder that sometimes the smallest companions leave the largest legacies.